Here, evolving, uh, I suppose, a bit We are I think that at this stage we shall start. So, we will be speaking in two languages. Please bear with me, those who don't speak English or Spanish. Estamos a punto de empezar, Les damos a todos la bienvenida al curso Incertidumbre, espacio y poder. ¿Por qué la geografía es importante en la economía política de lo financiero? Tenemos con nosotros al profesor Gary Dymski, tenemos con nosotros al profesor John Smith y a la doctora Penelope Hawkins, que nos van a hacer el favor de intervenir en este curso. También nos acompaña el doctor Luis Gómez, jefe del posgrado de la Facultad de Economía, y el doctor Jorge Bustamante, coorganizador de este evento. Les damos a todos la bienvenida. Si quieres, sorry, we will be speaking in both languages. We want to welcome you all, and we start with the course Uncertainty, Space and Power, Why Geography Matters in the Political Economy of Finance. With us are today Professor Gary Dymski, Professor John Smith, Professor Penelope Hawkins. So we shall start. We shall give, the organization will be more or less 45 minutes for the lecture, the main lecture, 10 to 15 minutes to the discussant, and then the discussion. It will be, we have all this through Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Jorge, por favor, sigues tú para que le des la palabra a Luis.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I'm going to make a little bit description of the course. You know, we have this course is divided in three lectures. Today's lecture is going to talk about the building blocks of a spatial approach to finance and the macroeconomic, and is followed by a comment made by Professor John Smith. Tomorrow's session is called Spatial Disequilibria and Power Imbalances, explaining the recurring episodes of crisis and stagnation in economic peripheries, followed by a comment made by Stefano Ionau. And Thursday's session is called Financial Inclusion and Financing Global Resilience, the micro, national, and global agendas for sustainable prosperity, followed by a comment made by Professor Penelope Hawkins. In the end of each session, we will have a discussion with the participants of the room, and you can leave your comments and questions in the Zoom chat, and we can pass them to the main speakers at the end of the every session. I'm going to switch now in Spanish to explain this. El curso, voy a hablar un poquito acerca de cómo se organiza el curso. Como sabrán, está dividido en 3 sesiones. La sesión de hoy se llama las bases del enfoque espacial de lo financiero y la macroeconomía. Y se va a seguir esta discusión por un comentario hecho por el profesor John Smith. La sesión de mañana se llama Desequilibrio espacial y balances regionales, que explican las crisis y el estancamiento en la periferia, seguido por un comentario por el profesor Stefano Ionau. Y la sesión del jueves se llama Inclusión financiera y resiliencia financiera global, las agendas micro, nacionales y globales para la prosperidad sustentable, que seguirá por un comentario de la doctora Penelope Hawkins, ¿no? Ustedes pueden al final de cada sesión dejar sus preguntas y comentarios en el chat y nosotros los pasaremos a los expositores. Bueno, esa es la dinámica del curso. Ahora yo le daría la palabra a nuestro jefe de posgrado, el profesor Luis Gómez Olivier.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Buenos días a todas, a todos. Me da mucho gusto poder darles la bienvenida a este curso que realmente está tocando temas que son de una gran relevancia y una gran actualidad. En primer lugar, quiero ofrecerles el saludo que envía el maestro Eduardo Vega, director de la Facultad de Economía, y en representación de él, darles la bienvenida a todos los asistentes en esta sesión. Quiero también agradecer al profesor Dymski, al profesor Smithin, a la profesora Hawking, por su presencia en esta sesión. Profesor Dymski, profesor Smithin, profesor Hawking, your participation is very much appreciated. También quiero hacer un reconocimiento a la doctora profesora Levy y al profesor Jorge Bustamante, quienes han conducido este proyecto para dar contexto al curso. Creo que hay un reconocimiento que debe ser hecho patente. Creo que el título del curso es sumamente atractivo. Vincula tres conceptos pues, que usualmente no están tan ligados en literatura, pero que en la realidad sí lo están. Incertidumbre, espacio y poder. La relación y la importancia de la geografía en la economía política y de la economía política en la geografía. Para algunos de nosotros, digamos, de cierta edad, nos tocó vivir los temas donde el comercio internacional generaba distorsiones, separaciones, y tenemos toda la historia de la escuela cepalina, de centro-periferia, de el deterioro secular de los términos de intercambio, etc. Había una dimensión geográfica, una dimensión económica y una dimensión de economía política. Eso ahora se ha multiplicado, se ha ampliado, se ha expandido enormemente. Lo acabamos de ver, lo estamos viviendo a partir de ayer con esta empresa inmobiliaria china. Una empresa inmobiliaria china que no afecta por sus construcciones, no afecta por sus edificios, afecta por sus finanzas. La situación financiera se ve comprometida e inmediatamente hay contagio, pero es un contagio que no es homogéneo, que no afecta a todos por igual, no afecta por igual a los países, no afecta por igual a los sectores, no afecta por igual a las empresas. Y hay quien se beneficia y hay quien se perjudica muy severamente. Y eso es una de las dimensiones que tenemos en este curso. Incertidumbre. Incertidumbre. Esa incertidumbre, espacio y poder vinculados es lo que estamos viviendo. Y creo que es una realidad que se nos impone y nos impacta. pero que no tenemos suficientes instrumentos para analizarla en forma oportuna, profunda y detallada. En ese sentido, yo quiero saludar con mucho entusiasmo el contenido de este curso y estoy seguro que pues, va a ser muy útil para nuestros estudiantes, para nuestros colegas y para todos los que tenemos la oportunidad de participar en el mismo. Les agradezco mucho a todos. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Bueno, ahora le damos la palabra a la doctora Noemí Levy. Su micrófono, doctora. Su micrófono, doctora, otra vez.
No me deja. Así. Muchas gracias, doctor Gómez Oliver, por la apertura de este curso. Thank you very much, Dr. Luis Gómez Oliver, for the introduction of this course. No quiero proceder sin agradecer a las autoridades de la Facultad de Economía, al Centro de Cómputo de manera especial, al Centro, a la hechura del cartel y demás. Sin ellos, imposible de hacer este curso. I would like to thank the faculty authorities for giving all the facility for doing this course, particularly the computer people who has been helping us a lot. I think we have a wide audience by now. I count 177 people, so it can be a very interesting discussion. I would like to start introducing, por favor, quiero empezar a introducir, al anterior, por favor, quiero empezar a introducir al doctor Gary Dymski, profesor titular de este curso que, como dijo el doctor Luis Gómez, es muy actual. El doctor, we have in Spanish, no tenemos en inglés, no tenemos una parte anterior, Jorge.
Nope.
¿Qué pasó? Tenemos que, a ver, empieza con, well, we had it in English, something happened. Voy a leer en español y después voy a decir en inglés las cuestiones más importantes. Doctor Gary Dymski, doctor en economía por la Universidad de Massachusetts, Amherst, Estados Unidos. Actualmente ocupa la plaza de profesor de tiempo completo en Leeds. Orientación académica, está ligada a la economía política con una fuerte inclinación a la multidisciplinaridad, particularmente geografía, estudios urbanos y ingeniería civil. Ha publicado más de 200 artículos sobre banca, fragilidad financiera, discriminación del mercado crediticio, la crisis de Asia, América Latina, financiamiento a la vivienda, la crisis del endeudamiento del subprime. El profesor Dymski ha sido académico invitado en universidades y centros de investigación en Brasil, Bangladesh, Japón, Corea, Gran Bretaña, Grecia e India. Miembro activo y cofundador del Leeds Act, que vincula organizaciones y universidades. Coinvestigador de proyectos con UNCTAD, cofundador de varias iniciativas que cooperan universidad y la región de West Yorkshire en la pandemia. Ha dirigido muchos proyectos de investigación. I think I will stop here. I want to introduce Professor Dymski. We had a slide, something happened. We told Dr. Dymski CV. I only want to highlight that he is a very well-known professor, has come a lot of time to Mexico. He's interested in Brazil and in general in Latin America, has been in India and Japan and other countries, and I think I'll stop here to give him the time and thank him very warmly to be with us this morning or afternoon, depending where you are. Please, Professor Dymski, you have, I would say, the microphone. I cannot say the chair now. You have the, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. And let's get, okay, are you seeing that one? Is it working okay?
Yes, no problem,
Now,
yes.
Now let me make it more proper as the slideshow.
Okay. En la primera parte del curso vamos a tener apagados micrófonos y video, y posteriormente la iremos prendiendo. In the first part of the course we will have videos and microphone muted, and then we'll slowly starting to switching them on. Thanks.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
So, thank you. So here's our series, 3 parts, and as was mentioned, today we're going to do some building blocks, and in particular, we're going to be focusing on why geography matters in political economy, and why, in a sense, political economy matters for geography. So that dialogue that I've been participating in for a long time. And I have to say, I want to begin by saying it's a pleasure to see some of my friends from Mexico and elsewhere in the world here with us tonight. And thank you for the sponsors, for their kind generosity in setting up this opportunity for us to reach out and find each other across these many strange times together. Okay, so there's the formula for today, and let's get into it. Our map is as follows. We're going to do, first of all, some basics about essentially why geography needs political economy, the endogeneity problem, and we'll do some critique of something called, I would say, aspatial analysis, and then talk about sort of some missing parts in geography. Then we'll get into some tools, and we're going to use these tools to set up some ideas about the political economy of credit. We're going to focus then on money and finance in particular, and then we'll do a little bit of a case study from the subprime crisis in the US. How much we'll do depends on how the time goes. So I want to start by acknowledging Noemi Levy. I've known Noemi for many years, and she is, as it says here, a warrior soul, a fighter for justice, unquenchable spirit. And thank you to Unam. And Unam really is a beacon of light amidst the fog of these times. And I'm going to dedicate each lecture specially. This one, as you could imagine, I'm going to dedicate to our late departed colleague, Eugenia Correa, professor of UNAM, who stays in our hearts and in our libraries and in our minds forever. Now, what we see is endogenous to what we expect to see. This is a famous graphic of this type of thing you see in a science museum, right? That shows you that you think these two lines in the middle are curved, and they are not. And the thing is that science museums show us our biases, right? That we go there, and they show us that we see what we expect to see. This is especially a problem in social science. If you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you are an economist and you're pre-committed to general equilibrium analysis, then any failure to be at equilibrium must be due to something that's blocking the equilibrium from happening. Now, you might not be willing, therefore, once you have this hammer in your hand, to admit that other factors, like maybe, how about the termination of social welfare support for low-income people, could explain stagnation? And how about the higher infrastructure costs and the greater problem of affordable credit and the greater availability of credit in more prosperous areas in your city? Is this part of your theory about why the poor areas stay poor? Well, what we see is indeed endogenous to what we're looking for. And the incidence of any phenomenon of interest can be mapped and can be, whether at the global cities, international financial centers or global pandemics. But the distribution of phenomena across space is not enough. It's just the first step toward understanding what is essentially a layered reality. And that's the first step toward seeing things spatially, is that things occur in layers. And basically what we see depends on the scale, the layer that we happen to pay attention to. And so observed patterns will vary as we adjust our granularity. That one, we can go immediately to just a couple of examples just to get our blood moving. Let's start with COVID maps. And a COVID map shows us that one snapshot is never enough. And I'll start with this one. Here's a COVID map from the New York Times about hotspots in the COVID crisis. You look at this map, and what does it tell you about where are the worst places of COVID outbreaks in the world? The dark places, United States and Mongolia, it looks like. So this is, one way of seeing. But basically, what we see shifts as we move from global to macro and even lower scales, as we go down to the regional, neighborhood, household, and even individual scale. And this is really the challenge of social geography, to propose and to set up an ordering, directions of causality on what we see. This is basically the idea of capturing relations that exist in time as well as space. Now, the LA geographer, the late Edward Soja, called this third space, the need to look in time and in space together in order to perceive all of what was there. Never from an objective viewpoint, but at least from the viewpoint that you're trying to capture. Now, space provides one of the dimensions we need for deeper work. And this is, time is another. Neither makes the other one redundant unless you already know what you're going to see. And there's the problem for many of the theories we have these days about social phenomena. Sometimes phenomena that should vary together don't. And in particular, this is something we'll get to tomorrow in particular, material interests and political consent are often different. We can look quickly at the Brexit vote, and then we can take a look at last week's California gubernatorial election, where they tried to recall the governor there. Now, to start, the idea in the UK is something we're working with there. It's called the idea of the geography of discontent. Parts of the country where people are very unhappy and are voting that way. These are the people who basically voted, and this idea came from our friend Philip McCann. They're voting to express their anger, their frustration. And this idea of how people are voting is one thing, how they are doing is another. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but just to show you one map on the referendum. So this is, first of all, the vote, should we leave Britain or should we leave Europe? Notice that if you look at the map on the left, what you see is that the south of the country was united to leave Europe. The north didn't want to. Fair enough. But if we look at it, that's because we're just counting there by county, leave and remain. If we go then down to the city scale, what we see, of course, is a much more differentiated map. And that's part of the idea. What are we looking at? Are we looking at the universal vision of England, except for London, that they don't want to be in Europe? Or are we looking at a much more complex picture? For example, Leeds, where I live, people wanted to stay in Europe. Now, another kind of example of this is the way that people vote. Here we have the votes for Trump in 2 elections. And this is California, of course. And notice that what we see here, the red votes for Trump, it's the inland and northern parts of the state. The other parts are for the Democrat, in that case, Biden or Clinton. Okay, so there's a kind of map there. Now, if we go further and we see, who signed up to make the petition to have the governor be replaced, here's one map over here that shows who the blue vote. The blue here are the people who wanted a recall vote. And then the orange are those who didn't. If we then go down to the county level, however, we see a much more particular picture. So, again, it varies by place. And just to say that while this is true, and you can see that the people who really wanted to get rid of the governor are the same people that really wanted Trump. But if you look then at where are people poor, well, child poverty rates are very high in these places here, and COVID rates among the Latino COVID rates are very high in these places that voted the other way mostly. Now, final map of California, if you look at where the hotspots are, people who feel that they're able to do their own thing, that don't care, the hotspots are up in those Trump areas. So, people vote in strange ways. Now let's go to the next part, that economists' aspatial analysis. Paul Krugman and Elhanan Helpman invented the idea of new trade theory in the 90s. The idea is that trade advantage follows from industrial agglomeration that's all about reducing transaction costs and enabling people to share information across and to generate increasing returns to scale. This was a revolutionary thing in trade theory because the idea is it's no longer about comparative advantage. It's about creating competitive advantage by creating, with industrial policy, large integrated firms that can be close together. Now, East Asia seemed to be the case in point. This new geography led to this new way of looking at what could motivate trade, increasing returns to scale. This basically led to a boom in the theory of competitive advantage and strategy theory, and also led to the new economic geography that showed how basically it's all about clusters, and bringing back cities in Europe and so on was all about industrial cluster analysis at the city scale. Now, Krugman was also trying to bring rigorous methods of economics to geography, get rid of the fuzziness, bring in mathematics. He's become increasingly Keynesian, of course, in his policy essays, but his formal modeling uses an Occam's razor logic required by the mainstream. That is, that theoretical models are defined by the number of deviations they have to make from Walrasian general equilibrium. I call this in one of the papers the neoclassical sink. So Krugman, keeps his membership card with the people who are committed to economic theory, to mainstream theory. And actually, we've seen this move again and again in mainstream theory, including in the new synthesis macroeconomic model. The thing I want to emphasize here is that in this theory, mainstream theory, there are no differences among spatial levels. There's only a level of agents and transactions. Time is continuous. You can use the probability calculus to figure out anything that's bothering you about stochastic variability, and you can turn everything into certainty equivalence. Now, here is an example of Woodford. Just as the crisis was hitting, he was restating the elements of the new synthesis in macro. Now, there's a lot of words here, and I'll leave these with you, but essentially, basically, we agree on intertemporal general equilibrium. And basically, we can use a single framework. It's important to use data, number two, but economists now focus on models built out of theory. Third, we accept the Lucas critique. We use rational expectations. We believe that people know the model and the government cannot fool them. We believe that basically things are shocked, that variations occur when there are shocks to otherwise smoothly flowing events. And finally, central banks should justify and try to control inflation. So basically, this is taking macro analysis and making it an applied branch of general equilibrium theory, as Farmer once wrote, saying that institutions can be understood if they're built out of theory. Theory should not be shaped according to the way real-world institutions are made, that real time does not exist, uncertainty is irrelevant, that space can be fully described as a subcategory of transaction costs. All analytical models are scale independent. Now, I have another view, and here is just one way of seeing it. This picture is a saudade from a speech I gave a long time ago in Minas Gerais. But the idea is that there's the globe as a distributive system of nations. A nation's a distributive system of regions. A regions has a system of cities, and so on down to the individual. And so these layers all interact. There's spatial scaling. And so actually even micro macro kind of disappears. It doesn't disappear, but it's that we have to think in an analytical way about how these things interact. Now, at the same time, we could say here that economists, this light touch approach to space, notional space, it uses space only as a way of categorizing and choosing among what would be, let's call them second best equilibria, equilibrium where there are transaction costs, you're outside of the Walrasian pure equilibrium case, and so you're trying to figure out which is the best place. There's no micro and macro level. Yeah, there's externalities, but the idea of a macro foundation for micro would be nonsense. And even the idea of a micro foundation for macro, popular in the 80s, is now gone. So instead of real space, now by real space, I mean that it's just when you have a real space analysis, your location in space, your country, your region, you yourself, it predetermines your options, your resources, and your constraints independently of your own capacities. That the contrast is with notional space. Notional space is just where you have it's a vehicle for non-zero transaction costs. And so basically, yeah, just to say that this is the approach you see, especially in urban mainstream economics and so on. Now, let's turn to geographers. So we're going to critique that and come up with some alternatives. Why geographers say so little about financial and political economic dynamics is kind of funny because actually there's been a growing body of geographic research on finance that's been stimulated to new heights by these system shaking financial crises and this long neglected financial instability. Now, bringing financial instability into focus makes room in geographic financial discourse for the impact of real-time and uncertainty. You do need these core elements, I would argue, I'm going to argue tomorrow, of Keynes' ideas if money and credit are to play an essential role in your analysis, and therefore to have an adequate basis for conceptualizing financial instability. So bringing in financial instability means moving in a Keynesian direction. That's my argument. Now, the thing is that for geographers, they're very appreciative of the work of David Harvey, who is probably the foremost living interpreter of Karl Marx in his writing. And Harvey, as part of his opus, has shown how money and credit relations are central to the capitalist dynamics that are indeed part of his central focus. What about capitalism and its crises and where its future? The thing is, though, in Harvey's analysis, there's a kind of functionalist approach to finance. Financial intermediation basically facilitates the circulation of capital. It allows the capital to go from places where you don't need it to places where you can usefully use it. He introduced the idea of a spatial fix, the idea that finance plays its role. And this leads to this idea that finance is part of the machine. In fact, this idea was given a name by Logan and Moloch in some famous work in which they describe the city as a growth machine. Probably Harvey would say, well, it's an accumulation machine. Now, some years later, Corbridge and Thrift, among what became many others, started to problematize money and to say, we've neglected the role of money and finance in geography. And they basically push off against Harvey's maintained hypothesis that is basically that financial phenomena, while they accompany capitalist crises, these crises are moved by deeper causes. So financial dynamics are epiphenomenal. They're not fundamental. They're just there. They're part of the show. And these scholars objected to that, and they began to create financial geography as a subfield of geography with many, many topics: financial exclusion, pension funds, and so on. Now, a huge literature emerged. And the thing is that this literature I summarized part of it on finance in a chapter in the New Oxford Handbook of Economic Geography, but there was little contact between heterodox economists and geographers. So we've had this growth of the geography of finance, growing literature on financialization that's exploded. But the key questions, the question of whether finance and financialization is epiphenomenal, a reflection of deeper forces at work in capitalist accumulation, hasn't really been confronted fully, even while Keynesian economists, the heterodox variety, really see the growth of finance as part of what's led to financial crises and macroeconomic turmoil and collapse. So there's this kind of, the Keynesians are pretty sure that finance is part of the problem. And many even influential geographers, I include Brett Christophers here, a very brilliant man and important contemporary, and again, a geographer and interpreter of Marx. And basically, he's argued that the term financialization is problematic. He says that, well, it means everything and nothing. And in fact, he's asserted in some dialogue that the subprime crisis itself can be attributed to the end of Fordism. That is, to the rise of the global factory, to the rise of Reagan and Thatcher back in the 1980s. So that is, in a sense, the subprime crisis is epiphenomenal. So, we need to talk, right? We have to talk, because while it is true that the resources we need for human provisioning are not homogeneously spread across space, as Professor Luis Gomez said in his opening comments, in recent years, we've seen this mutual interest among geographers and economists in interdisciplinary work and talking with each other. And this is something that's been hard for us. Now, the next several pages, I'll show you how it's still hard. This is something I did, I guess, last night. I went through the Web of Science topic words, and I looked at the frequency of different words as they appear in leading journals in heterodox and mainstream economics journals, and then also in journals that are in the area of urban and regional studies and geography. And basically, let's say that we have to talk. Now, here's the journals I went through. I just chose 4 heterodox economics journals. I chose 6 mainstream economics journals, and then a pretty wide range of geography and urban and regional studies journals. Now, check it out. We're just going to look at the results when you plug in certain words as topic words into these spaces. So the first words are financial crisis or financial crises. And what you see here is that actually everybody uses these words quite a lot, and the mainstreamers do, and the regional studies people do, and so do the heterodox economists. This is frequencies of annual average mentions in these journals, in these collected journals over these different periods of time. So time is going left to right here. And you can see how there's this explosion with the subprime crisis of interest in financial crisis. Tells you something, right, about how much people are paying attention to Latin America back here in these English language journals. Okay, but how about financialization as a topic word? Well, actually, if you look at this word, notice that this is a word that geographers and regional studies people are using a lot. So are heterodox economists. Mainstream people, basically not at all. How about the words financial instability or financial fragility as topic words? And here again, now here's where you see that divide. So rather than geographers and heterodoxy being together, here you see that essentially neither the mainstream nor regional studies geography journals are making much use of these words, whereas for heterodox economists, these are fundamentally important words. And we see an even more radical divide if we use the word Minsky, Hyman Minsky, the great so-called founder of financial instability hypothesis. And what we see here is basically he's iconic, mentioned frequently in the heterodox journals as a topic word, right? Not as a source, as a topic. But here, very seldom in the others. So let's get to some tools for spatial analysis. We're going to talk about, first of all, just the basic logic of cross-border macro and financial imbalance. And then we'll get into the political economy of credit, money, and space. If we have time, we'll talk a bit about the subprime crisis in the US. Now, basically, the first thing is that one of the few things that's true in economics is that flows across borders have to balance for every spatial area. If you think of it, a currency that flows one direction, let's say the current account means like trade balance. So basically, there's a trade balance sending currency out of the country to another place, and then the other place is buying the goods from you. At the end of that day, there's going to be an imbalance. Let's suppose that you basically sent money out of the country. Well, if you sent money out of the country so that you have you've got a deficit on current account, so this is a negative, then, well, how is that going to balance? Well, first of all, if you have a negative here, your reserves, your monetary reserves could be decreased. This would be a negative too. An alternative is that you could have an inflow of capital from abroad. Now, notice that this is a negative in front of the capital inflows. So you can afford to have a negative current account balance if at the same time you are bringing in money from outside. Otherwise, you got to spend down your reserves. So essentially, trade flows between any two spaces, any countries don't have to balance. In fact, they most likely won't. And it's also true that in principle, at least, the sum of all trade flows across all geographic areas in the world as a whole should balance out. But essentially, if all the places, for example, are in surplus, the n-1 countries, for example, then the nth country can be in deficit. That's a theory I heard, by the way, at the Brookings Institution a long time ago. They were happy with that because that deficit country was the United States. Now, let's then say, okay, so we've got exports minus imports is equal to, so there's our current account, equals minus of capital inflows and plus changes in reserves. Now, capital inflows can be called foreign savings. Think of it as foreigners' savings, foreign savings, SF, and so on. So we have X minus M equals minus SF plus delta R. Now, essentially, if this is positive, if trade is positive, and then the change in reserves is positive, then foreign savings is negative. Foreign savings negative means that we are investing in other countries. And so, you see these balances all across the way. Now, if we look at just one nation state and go to the macro level for a minute, what we see here is that basically there's this kind of, very well-known macro condition. Aggregate demand has to equal aggregate supply. Now, let's just keep in mind here, we're going to use intended and unintended investment to force these two things into equality so that it's not a question of that intentional is equal to intentional, but that there can be a buildup of inventories or a spend down of inventories, as happens when there's an imbalance between supply and demand. So we have consumption, investment, and government spending, and then foreign purchases. On the left, who buys our goods? On the right, just a simple representation, of the supply of goods. Now, the thing about it is that the supply of goods can be broken down into income claims on production. Now, basically, income, of course, we can have a class perception. We can look at the factors, and we can look then at profits and wages and so on, as some of my colleagues do, kind of a Koletsky approach. Or we can just go directly and say, well, no matter if you're a capitalist or a worker or a rentier, you basically are going to be able to use your money, your income, for one of four things: consumption, savings, taxes, or you can buy imports. So we restate demand equals supply as demand equals supply in this way. And then if we jiggle this around a little bit, then we get that investment plus here is government minus taxes, government spending minus taxes. There's your government deficit probably if G is greater than T. So on the left, we have what has to be financed, investment plus our deficit. How do we finance it? Well, S, domestic savings, but then there's this minus X minus M. Now, let's go immediately to that statement again and just notice from our other equation, that first equation, if we just remember that equation, exports, net exports, X minus M, was equal to SF plus delta R. Now, if we take this equation and put it into equation 2, we get this kind of master equation that depicts cross-border balances, what has to be true. And again, it's one of the few things in economics that's always true. Again, with this, generous disequilibrium included definition of investment. That is that investment plus government deficit can be financed by three things. First, domestic savings. Secondly, foreign savings, that is capital inflows. Thirdly, you can spend down your reserves. There's what has to be financed and what you have available to finance it with. Now, my point here is this. This relationship is true not just for a nation state, it's true for every spatial area. It holds at every level. So that's something that we have to think about, because basically it means that, there's these imbalances and flows across borders. And, if we want, for example, suppose we're trying to bring about investment in a low income area, an area that's poor, we want investment there. How's it going to happen? Well, people there are poor. And suppose we want to have government spending there too. Well, the people there aren't going to have much savings. So, and the people there aren't going to have much in the way of reserves. So if we want to have investment and government spending in a poor area, we have to have transfers into that area. Doesn't have to be a poor area, but I'm just saying, this is how things work spatially. So there's always this spatial dynamic that's at work as we try to think about sub areas, as we move up and down the macro down to micro scales. Now, next step on the political economy of credit, money, and space. So essentially, we've seen in the years since 1980, this increasing, breakdowns of financial markets. We've seen credit market, money market meltdowns. We've seen financial starvation, booms and busts, a lot of wild things that tell us that as finance has been freed, that we see a lot of malfunctions in financial markets. And here I'm going to, of course, push back against Brett. I'm sympathetic to the argument that the factors identified into the many different factors in Marxian theory are quite important. But in my mind, the malfunctions that are possible in finance bring their own contribution to crises as we see across the world. And so indeed, we note from our core analysis there that it's the financial system, those foreign savings, those domestic savings, where they go. Do they stay in the same area? Do they cross borders? These factors here are fundamental in terms of managing the uneven distribution in space and in time of money and credit. And these connect these areas that have uneven distributions of assets, processes, wealth, workers, capitalists, and so on. So, a lot of investment is spatialized. A lot of investment is done with productive assets, buildings that have fixed spatial locations and is irreversible. When assets are irreversible, their value depends on the forces that impinge on the space where they're located. However, money is mobile and it moves with people across space. So one of the tensions that we immediately have in the political economy of credit, money, and space is between places where are you going to have your irreversible investments, and how does that match up with the desire of people who have wealth to be able to move with their wealth across space, to have wealth that is in liquid form. And the fact that, there's different timescales at which things move, that buildings are sold, goes into boom or bust, et cetera. This creates some of the tensions in the financial system. Now, here's just a couple of illustrations of the points. And activity in any area involves, as noted, financial balances and imbalances. You can imagine any space as having a capital account surplus or a balance and a current account balance. And so if there's a place that's got a trade surplus, spending, for example, it earns, sends abroad more dollars, more goods and services than it buys, then essentially there's money that ends up from that area that's in deficit that goes into this other area. Here I've got reais, that looks like the dollar, and R is the Brazilian real sign. And so the gray area is building up reserves of reais, as in this case, this area is essentially, building up the surplus there. Now, this right-hand side, this could be a country. It could be Uruguay, or it could be a favela inside a city where basically people in the favela go and they work in the city, they buy goods and services made elsewhere. And so the favela depends on, right, having income that's earned by labor that's exported into the city, people doing domestic service and other jobs that bring the money home and then use that money to buy the goods and services they need, because the favela doesn't have much production. So there's an example of this relationship that's fundamental. And of course, this kind of situation exists at all levels. We have, goods exchanged for T-bills in the case of US and China. And then we have actually that favela relationship in the previous page is just the kind of relationship of a rich US suburb where rich people go and work in the inner city, maybe in the city of London or Wall Street, make their money, and then buy from the rest of the world. Now, this contrast between liquid and illiquid, between reversible and irreversible investments, we have some strategic coordination problems that are fundamental here in this system as we know it. There's basically spillovers between one area and another. Now, what I want to do is compare here two banks, Bank A and Bank B. These two banks are considering whether they should make loans in Area 1 or loans in Area 2. Now, essentially, one possibility is that, so where does Bank A go and where does Bank B go? Now, notice that essentially, if Bank A goes into Area 1 and Bank B goes into Area 1, then Bank A's loans benefit from the spillover of the investment of Bank B in that area and vice versa. The same thing would be true if both banks make loans in Area 2. So as long as there's loans going into both areas benefit, the bank's loans there benefit from the spillover benefits of the investment of the financing provided by the bank, the competitor bank. So here we have, portfolio diversification and can raise the returns on both of these banks. But now suppose we have a problem in which essentially there's one area where basically people don't make loans. There's an area that people avoid. Let's call it Area 2. Nobody loans there. All the loans are made in Area 1. Well, in this case, you're going to have potentially a flood of liquidity and credit in Area 1. And by contrast, asset illiquidity, you can't sell your irreversible assets here. You can't sell your house. And you're starving of credit over here. So you have this imbalance between areas that are privileged and underprivileged. Now, there's many reasons to think that spillovers of this kind matter. There's one reason is this idea of increasing returns to scale and lines of production. I was kind of criticizing the new economic geography earlier, but let's face it, there is something to it. And the idea is that this agglomeration can lead to the coming in of one firm benefiting from the presence of another in the same area. So you can capture spillovers and you can accelerate innovation and maximize profit. Another reason to think spillovers matter is that basically this is the construct of creative city that Richard Florida came up with. The idea that cultural spillovers can arise in dense urban environments. People like to hang out. they have clubs, they have things they like to do that can lead to areas becoming prosperous. And just to say that, credit markets are socially constructed. We see there what we expect to see, and we see basically lenders coordinating where the spillovers exist. And if there's places where people want to live, places where they don't want to live, places they want to be, and places they don't want to be. This is going to have implications. So we're going to see, basically disequilibrium as a normal case. Equilibrium flows are going to be very rare, and you're going to have monetary and financial relations as crucial in all economic interactions. You can invisibilize them, but they're still present in the real world. And basically, once you introduce space into monetary and financial analysis, you can't reduce one level of analysis to another. The region remains analytically visible within the nation, the city within the region, and so on. So basically, balanced or imbalanced growth affects the overall growth rates. Now, let's just say here we have, suppose we have, again, our two areas, area one that gets all the loans, and area two that doesn't get any. So we're going to have a low income area and a high income area, asset rich and asset poor. And basically, if credit flows into that second area, there's the danger of financial fragility. And so there's, a kind of problem. You have this kind of path dependence with market forces. If they're simply responding, money going to where it's already going to be well suited, where there's a lot of a buildup of investment, then market forces left alone are going to widen regional and urban disparities. And basically, there's going to be this kind of problem. Now we've had this picture, so I'll leave it alone just to say that this exists at every level. Now, Hyman Minsky talked about, the idea of spatial analysis of financial fragility. And I just want to say that we can spatialize Minsky by taking into account that flows across borders, across international borders, and flows of money inside national borders interact. We can have basically areas where, of say a country where foreign money is coming in, 1980s California, and so on, the subprime lending boom in the 2000s, and other areas where basically nothing is happening, where there's nobody's lending. Now, in the interest of time here, I'm going to be I think I'll skip this until later on, because I'll have a chance to go through kind of the globalized or the spatialized Minsky a little bit later. But just to say that essentially, what we see is the idea that there's areas that are included and areas that are excluded. And I want to just spend the last several minutes of my talk today talking about problems of financial inclusion and exclusion, and talking about them not at the level of the individual unit, but of spatial areas as well. And so we have, there's exclusion, inclusion, and then exploitation, which is exploitation is existing when units can only get financial services at higher prices than other units. And so we're welcoming Sunanda Sen here, so that's a good thing. And essentially just to say that space matters here and really makes a difference. And so what we're going to do is we're going to play with a little model done by Thomas Schelling. And now this graph here was originally done for a presentation in Brazil. So Vazio is empty, Branco is white, and Preto is black. And Schelling had a model where he explained racial segregation by setting up a checkerboard and saying, now imagine that there's individuals, some are black, some are white, Branco and Preto, and they occupy different spaces. And suppose that we have a situation in which, for example, the whites don't want to be around the blacks. If so, then if they're free to move across the board, they would move to spaces far from blacks. And so essentially, because of racial preference, racial, feeling that the whites don't want to be around black folks, that we're going to have this kind of segregation emerging because of white flight. Now, this is a toy model, but suppose we take this model and kind of play with it, and we can build up a little story that's going to end up pretty quickly here in several minutes into the essence of what became, first of all, the redlining of inner city areas, the denial of credit to people living in the US inner city, whereas credit flowing a lot into those suburbs. Now, so we have prosperous suburbs, lots of home ownership, lots of jobs, firms are growing, and then we have a stagnant area. Now you'll notice that this has everything to do with that contrast between area 1 and area 2 in our abstract representation. There's the central city there, central. And basically, you know, we can have a situation where banks responding to this can redline. They can refuse to make loans in areas that have a lot of Black or brown residents because basically those areas are not prosperous areas. They put their assets at risk if they lend there because other banks aren't lending there. This also works. So here we go, a situation of redlining, where, you know, basically these folks in this part of the city can't get loans, whereas there's a lot of loans out there in the prosperous suburbs. Now, you know, this leads to a situation where, yeah, it's going to be racial discrimination, could be discrimination as well, but the two things really interact. They interact because of the spatial segregation of people across the space of the city. And just to say that this was historically important, and let me just go past a couple of slides here and say that, you know, what ended up happening in the real world was that we had banks competing for businesses in the super included areas out in the, again, privileged areas, upper income, mostly white, looking here at the US case. And by contrast, in the inner city area, we had a zone of predatory lending. That's where the subprime loans were first made. Basically, 93% of these loans were made by 25 companies, mostly owned by the large mega banks, who were taking advantage of the fact that regular banks wouldn't lend here. Regular banks would only lend here, so they could offer predatory, high-cost loans to people who often were unable to get credit elsewhere. The consequence was that, you know, just as this is just what we saw before, a low-income, asset-poor region and a high-income, asset-rich region. And, you know, the results, as we saw, growing wealth and then asset stripping. And basically, I'm going to go right to a picture, I think that's at the very end here, just to show you. Yeah, that essentially we had subprime loans made in some places. They grew with time. And then as the subprime boom turned into a subprime crisis, you then see foreclosures, losses of homes, losses of jobs, and the other areas stagnating, but basically, you know, left in a different situation. And essentially more subprime loans made and so on in these areas. And essentially we have this situation where the subprime crisis can be interpreted as a situation where banks who were required by law to loan evenly in throughout their entire market areas didn't do so. There were coordination problems, and in particular, even when the US Congress made an effort to require that the banks, for example, serving this entire spatial area would make loans throughout the area, they didn't do it. The banks tended to focus where they knew that competitor banks were making other banks in stable areas with stable housing prices. And instead they left this other area to the predatory markets. Now, the irony is that as housing boom went along in areas where housing prices really rose, what we saw was a situation where subprime loans spread across the entire country. And for some time, the entire country went into a deep crisis. Now, it didn't stay there. It didn't stay there it didn't require fully, as people that talk about secular stagnation talk about, but it came out of that crisis in a more robust way than it otherwise could have, because, of course, the United States itself is part of a global system of power that's reflected in the way that financial assets, financial institutions operate, that's reflected in the kinds of imbalances that different countries can maintain or not maintain. And that's going to be the topic that we'll pick up tomorrow as we get deeper into it. So thank you for your attention. I think what we'll do is we'll stop right here. And these are just some summary points about irreversibility, ability, and the fact that, this real space is always here, just as real time is, and this irreversibility is a problem. And then just to say that all relations are spatially scaled, that, microeconomics should be macro founded, because the higher level always frames the lower level, the urban or the country. The country frames the urban frames the neighborhood, and so on. And also that spatial imbalances are inevitable. This is a point that Varoufakis has made very forcefully in some of his work. You need basically flows that go against the flow of success. You have to finance your lower income areas if you want them to prosper, if you want to build up assets there. And that means some coordination of market processes, because market processes tend to expand and augment imbalances. And social justice, therefore, paying attention to lower income areas and the people who live there, does require cross-border transfers. That means that if we're interested in social justice to redress those imbalances, we've got to deal with those problems. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll share all these slides. I'm going to stop my sharing right now and turn it back over to Noemi. Noemi, it's your show.
Gary, thank you very much. A very interesting lecture. I will share now, if I found it. Yes, here it is. My presentation, because there I have John Smithin CV, which I welcome to discuss. Here we put in English for the English-speaking people, and for John Smithin in particular, his CV, and I will let know the Spanish-speaking people with whom who will be the discussant of this lecture. John Smithin es codirector ejecutivo y miembro del Instituto de Filosofía Aurora y profesor emérito de Economía y académico senior de la Universidad de York en Toronto, Canadá. Anteriormente ocupó cargos docentes en la Universidad de Calgary y el Politécnico de Lancaster en Coventry, en Inglaterra. En 95-96 fue elegido By Fellow en el Robinson College de la Universidad de Cambridge. Tiene un doctorado y una maestría por la Universidad de y la literatura en el City London Polytechnic. Sus intereses de investigación se encuentran en los campos de política macroeconómica, teoría monetaria, filosofía del dinero y las finanzas. Es autor y coeditor de debates en Monetary Macroeconomics, de próxima publicación Beyond Barter, 2021, Rethinking the Theory of Money, Credit and Macroeconomics. Tiene libros muy importantes en qué es el dinero, que lo usamos en clases. Tiene esta idea de el rentista capitalista, la revolución de los rentistas. Creo que estamos ante un gran pensador económico heterodoxo que, como dijo Gary Dymski, toma en cuenta los supuestos del mundo real para hacer sus análisis. Please, Gary, go ahead. Yes, I said in Spanish that we used a lot of your books. What is Money is the one that everyone knows here, and I think you are, although you don't think, specific analysis, space analysis are very much in your work. Thanks, and we give you the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi, for that handsome introduction. which I do appreciate. And I would like to thank you, Gary, for a very interesting presentation. And before I go on, I would just like to say how very much I appreciated your dedication to Eugenia. And I'm sure everyone will agree on that. Now, you realize I didn't get your slides until yesterday, was it? Or fairly recent. So the remarks I prepared were mostly based, I would say, on the philosophical and methodological issues which were raised in your two reference papers that you sent. And that's what they'll be orientated towards. However, going through your talk now, I just do want to mention one thing or highlight one thing that you did in the tools section. I think where you were talking about the cross-border flows and how they must balance or not balance. I was interested in that, and it's too complicated to go into in any great detail now, but and maybe we'll, discuss this together at some point in the future. But I did address that issue in my forthcoming book, Beyond Barter, which Naomi mentioned. And the bottom line of that is that, yes, the trade balance as a percentage of GDP must balance in the global sense across all the spaces, but not so the primary budget deficit as a percentage of GDP for a sovereign, MMT would call it for a sovereign economy, right? All of those sovereign economies could be running budget deficits if they wanted to. And nor in each individual country, nor does autonomous spending as a percentage of GDP less the propensity to save have to balance. Now, notice I didn't say investment equals savings there. It's autonomous spending minus the marginal propensity to save. Well, the point is, if the trade balances must balance, at some point, not so for the primary budget deficit, not so for this autonomous spending, minus the propensity to save. What does that mean? Well, there is the space for growth. That's precisely where there is the space for growth. And that's precisely Keynesianism as it was interpreted in America, running budget deficits. And it was precisely Keynesianism as interpreted by Keynes, what did he call it? The paradox of thrift. Exactly that. So I won't pursue that any further because, as I say, we will have to go into more details. On the broader issues that you raised, which I did find very interesting, I think it is true that many philosophers and social scientists, including myself, have tended to focus mainly on questions of social ontology and the construction of social reality, to use John Searle's phrase, to the neglect of the more materialistic aspects, including geography. So yes, your project is certainly a welcome refocusing of attention, if I can put it that way. In the most general terms then, your thesis surely makes a lot of sense. And by the way, some of the slides you didn't show today, I looked at some of your slides, some of which had to do with British regional economic policy. And I was reminded that once upon a time, 48 years ago to be precise, I did a case study in that field in the southwest, in Cornwall, which at that time was a very underdeveloped region. And I see that now you are doing a similar sort of thing for the north, by which I mean that vast and unexplored territory north of Watford, which I found interesting. So there's a sense in which we can argue, yes, of course, geographical location has indeed made a big difference. Now I am orientated to North America, not to the UK, and you are orientated to England, in addition to Latin America. And that seems like a reversal of the natural order of things, somehow.
No doubt.
In some of the materials that you sent, and maybe this was in the original introduction to the course, I was struck with your threefold classification of the domain of economic inquiry. And it went something like this. One domain was inequality, which somewhere you associated with Marx. Inequality has to do with Marx. time, which you associated with Keynes, that is to say, fundamental uncertainty in historical time, right? And then finally space, which you associate with the new economic geography, as you call it. And so, yeah, I took that in, but then I was thinking about this for a while, and I realized that inequality as such is not really a philosophical primary. The inequality is the result or the outcome of the social relationships. So I think I would like to modify your three categories to read something like the first category is social relations, social ontology, which then would lead to the inequality, obviously time and space. And then thinking about that again, it seemed, well, there's something else missing. What else is missing? Well, namely the actual stuff, you know, the resources, the raw materials, the oil or whatever that we use, right? So perhaps we should expand the list to 4 to read social relations, time, space, matter. You know, have the 4 categories instead of the 3. And by the way, this is something that seems to come up all the time in philosophy. You know, some people like to do things in 3s, you know, have 3 categories, but almost invariably it's found that you have to bring in a 4th one and draw a 4-quadrant diagram. In politics, for example, we do that all the time. So having got to this stage, then a philosopher would probably identify the first term as having to do with idealism in some sense. And the remaining 3, the social relations has to do with idealism. In the remaining 3 is materialism, time, space, matter. By the way, I hope that we're not going to entertain at all the Kantian idea that time and space themselves are products of the human mind, or at least I'm not going to entertain that view. I take your view that geography matters. But anyway, in this case, in this very area, I think, is where some of the most interesting work in social ontology is currently being done. In fact, realism, metaphysical realism, is not coextensive with materialism. They're not the same thing. What I mean by this is that even though they are immaterial, social facts are nonetheless real, with square quotes around them, and very often binding on the participants in a given society. They can't escape from those social constraints. And moreover, they can and do have causal effects on the material world itself. And 2 obvious examples which you raise are money and international borders. Money is obviously a social relation, and international borders are really, they're entirely artificial from the purely geographical point of view. So if someone does not have enough money, they can starve to death, right? The international boundaries, which are really just lines on a map, do have an obvious physical impact. They have an impact on the spatial location of billions of people, you know, to the extent that they're respected. And so I think that the implication for your project of what I'm saying would be along the lines of asking this question, which of these things is the most real? The social or the physical or material? You know, which of these is the more real? What is the cause and effect? And I would be very interested to see how you respond to that issue in particular. Now, I would like to close, if there is time, with some examples in which the social does seem to have trumped the geographical. And again, I apologize, these examples are all from North America, which seems to be my irredeemable bias now. But what I'm asking is, what are the implications of these counterexamples for your thesis? Do the examples confirm it, or do they go against it? You know, how do they fit in? The 3 I'm going to mention, I'll mention them first and then explain it, each. The first is economic development in the Canadian province of Newfoundland versus Iceland. That's number one. Number two, interest rates in Halifax and Vancouver on the east coast and the west coast of Canada, respectively, as compared to Boston and Seattle. And the third one, which I would mention, is economic and environmental, both conditions, in Haiti and the Dominican Republic on the island of Hispaniola. In that case, of course, they literally share the same geographical space, but both economic and environmental conditions vastly differ as between those two. I'll just elaborate a little bit. The point is that with the Newfoundland and Iceland, Iceland is far more developed economically than Newfoundland. The question is why? They're both islands, in the North Atlantic. They both have fishing, they have similar climate, et cetera, right? Both have tourism to a certain extent and degree, and yet Iceland typically does very much better than Newfoundland. To me, the obvious point is that Newfoundland has the disadvantage of being embedded in a currency union, which is not appropriate for it. Namely and Newfoundland would have been much better had they never joined Canada in that particular case. They would have developed in a similar fashion, to Iceland. The interest rates in Halifax and Vancouver, bottom line there is if roughly speaking, Halifax is in Nova Scotia. It's not the one you're thinking of. It's in Nova Scotia on the east coast. The mortgage rates will be kind of roughly similar in Halifax and Vancouver, even though they're 3,000 miles or whatever it is apart and in totally different geographical space. Similarly, interest rates in Boston and Seattle will not be that different. However, the interest rate between interest rates will be very different as between Halifax and Boston and as between Vancouver and Seattle, seemingly in defiance of the geography. Obviously the Haiti and Dominican Republic one, both would be classed as, poor nations or developing nations against some standard, but the contrast between the two is remarkable in terms of economic development and environmental conditions. And so it can only be the fact that they are different, nation states have different, I don't know if they do have different currencies and whatever. So those are the kind of things that I think, would address, which is the more real, the social or the physical, the material? And what about those kind of counter examples that I mentioned? How would they fit in with your general thesis? I think that's about it.
Thank you very much, John. As usual, very interesting, your comments. I knew that we have a philosopher and a very knowledgeable person in many issues. Thank you again. Agradecemos la participación del profesor John Smithy. Tenemos un conocedor profundo de las relaciones monetarias financieras y una persona que se ha dedicado a estudiar la filosofía detrás de esos eventos. Gracias. I wonder, Gary, if you want to answer, John, and we recollect questions, or how you want to proceed.
Let me quickly respond to a couple of points, and then let's open the floor for questions. This was a marvelous reflection, and I do apologize for presenting the PowerPoint only very late in the day. Let me comment on two aspects. First, there's certainly no intention in the algebra that I present or rather, actually, just the adding up that things must balance part by part. For example, primary balance, budget balances for national states. To the contrary, that the focus here is on the idea that flows across borders are inevitable and equilibrium quite unlikely. And so this idea of exchange across borders is something that is always implicit in efforts to think about economic development, and that so that we'll get to that in the social aspect of that in a minute. But just to say that John reminds us, I hadn't thought of the fact that one should not think that I'm talking about balanced budgets or investment equals savings or savings constrained investment. No, I'm a Keynesian for sure, but in those respects. But actually, John reminds us that this framework that I've been playing with kind of links into the framework developed by, actually, I think of Wynne Godley and Mark Lavoie and some of the work that they've done over time at the Levy Institute. And the way that, in a sense, this idea that you have to look at the world as wholes. And in Wynne's many, he would do these graphs and show you how basically if one part of the world was in a certain kind of macro balance, it would imply or imbalance, there would be implications for the rest of the world. And that if the regions in these, or the countries in these different parts made the wrong decisions, they would end up basically squeezing the entire whole by going in the wrong direction. This, of course, is actually part of the inspiration that it was that real, kind of insertion of Warren Mosler and then Randy Ray and some of the folks at the later Stephanie Kelton and so on at the Levy Institute, initially with Wynne there, and then thinking in these ways that led to this kind of really creative outpouring of ideas that turned into MMT. Now, whether or not we can say that, with modern monetary theory, that every country in the world should just go and create its as much money as it needs, take the taxes, and buy the goods and services to bring its people to something like prosperity, that gets into actually whether or not that works is going to go through something we're going to talk about in the next session in particular, the differential status of currencies and the differential power that people have to work with currencies or to convert wealth into and out of currencies and different reserves. And that, of course, goes to John's challenge of thinking about, for example, the social or the material, which balances which. And I would say, clearly the cases you cited, John, are fascinating. And I think, we could, in a sense, think of many kind of paradoxes or situations where choices made about how spaces are governed or the lack of choices about how spaces are governed, and then the implications of that within the, like, let's say, for example, in the case of Newfoundland, we can think of the problem of, say, do the representatives of Newfoundland inside Canada have the ability to change Canadian policy to be, hospitable to their need for development? Well, no, they're a minority in minority. They got a problem. So the social realities, the way that social realities are embedded then in political orders, really make a difference. So I would say that the social constraints and can shape the way that the material is worked. I mentioned just briefly the fact that the triumph of Asia, it's coming, which we'll talk about a bit tomorrow. The coming of Asia onto the world stage had to do with a region that was, in many cases, especially Japan, resource poor, but that was organized in a particular way that led it to have a global imprint. But I would say as well that in many places, many cases, we see that there are ratchet effects wherein social constraints, the inability of people to convert their wealth into other forms of money or assets, the absence of wealth, the absence of of resources for education and so on lead to constraints that actually become embedded in national, regional, local, racial, gender inequalities that then can be accepted by many as the natural order of things. So they look across material reality, and differences in material reality appear to justify social orders founded on the idea that some are worth more than others. And this is part of what I think we have to always push against. And I'll say more about the Keynesian tomorrow, but I appreciate that the spirit of your intervention is just marvelous, and all that you've said as well is really lots of food for thought. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Abrimos por favor video y micrófono. We shall open now video and micros. We have about 4 questions, I believe. Diego Molina, Gustavo Gutiérrez, Carlos. Pregunto, ¿quieren hacer las preguntas directo o las leo del chat? Diego Molina es el primero que vi. ¿Estás ahí? Estamos hablando ya.
Sí, profesora.
Adelante, por favor. Recuerden un favor, recuerden que tenemos que ser breves y al punto, porque sí tenemos varias participaciones. Por favor, chicos, me ayudan, que no se me vaya a pasar nadie. Adelante, por favor, y me da gusto saber que todavía tenemos 172 participantes con nosotros. Ha sido un récord. Gracias.
Ok.
Adelante. Prende tu micrófono, por favor.
Sí. To the professor and Gary, what is the implications of the economy distorted with the depth borders?
Your mic is.
The mic.
A ver, no entiende. Gary, did you understand the question?
Yes, and it was written
Then
clearly
we take
in the.
3.
Okay, that's fine. It was written very
Gustavo
clearly in the chat as
Gutiérrez.
well. Yeah.
Sí, Gustavo Gutiérrez, ¿quieres hacer tu pregunta en vivo y directo? Adelante, Gustavo. Hola, leemos de aquí. Could you see Gustavo Gutiérrez question because he's not.
Yes. Easy.
Okay.
It's very clear question. Yes.
Okay, and then goes Carlos. Carlos, ¿quieres hacer tu pregunta en vivo?
No, dijo que no, doctora.
Sí,
Dijo
sí
no.
que. Si quiere la hago, no me preocupa.
Por favor.
Ok, entonces la digo. Bueno, es que eran. Ok, breve.
Adelante, por favor.
Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Dymski. Well, I have 3 questions. I try to be very short. The first is, what do you think that, for example, defines that kind of decision? For example, the racial segregation. What does explain that kind of decision? It's not, for example, the concept of mode of production kind of useful for understanding space in that historical perspective. For example, before capitalism, the space was built upon the idea of fields. But now in capitalism, the people live in cities, and that creates a lot of, for example, environmental problems. Cannot we think beyond the city as the core of way of organization of the space? Because some of your presentation was very biased to the urban and city space. I think it's because we live in capitalism, but we cannot think beyond that. And what would be the role of the theory of geography and economics to try to create a better way of organizing this space? Thank you very much.
Gracias, Carlos. Marcia, sabemos que quieres hacer una pregunta. ¿Quieres hacerla en vivo? Profesora Marcia, ¿estás por ahí? ¿Sí la ves, Jorge?
No,
I
no la
will-
veo.
okay, I will make Professor Marcia Solorza is asking Gary Dymski the following question. Private debt is having a negative effect on the current account. Can we think of a negative multiplier effect if we add the unequal distribution of income? And if I may, I want to ask also in this group, I was wondering when you were speaking, Gary, where the analysis of space was lost. Because if I remember correctly, the dependentist theory, the structuralist theory, was based on a spatial analysis. Yeah, we try to understand why countries in Latin America were underdeveloped, and if they could develop, and if they could develop in the same way as as in developed countries. So when it was lost, it's clear that uncertainty has stood, but spatial analysis somewhere fade away. I'm also recalling Van Silver's black box, which is very similar to what you pose, where
Yeah.
it went. Is it a problem of ideology?
Yeah,
Thank
I appreciate that. Let me go through these in order, if I may. Let's start with Diego's question. Will the implications of an economic structures be debt burdens? You know, that will, and of course, thinking of the kind of dynamics I was suggesting. And in some sense, the answer is yes. Their activity that is between people who have different levels of capacity or who have to borrow, there will be debt created in many cases. Now, this goes beyond questions that, of the banks being able to create money through its own loan-making process. But that will be accompanied by lots and lots of credit, of loans that are offset on the other side by liabilities. And so, yes, in a complex society, there's going to be a buildup of asset and liability structures, that is, of debt. And it's not a problem to have debt, depending on, whose debt it is and whether or not it has to be repaid. For example, in the modern monetary theory approach, they would say, well, the central bank can create the money to provide the means by which people can pay their taxes. That, in some sense, is a debt of the government, of the central bank, but it's so long as that supports growth, it's not a problem. What's happened in many parts of the world, however, is that we see a move toward a situation in which, when countries get into trouble, when there's an external payments problem, they're subjected to discipline, often by the International Monetary Fund, and then their macro policies are constrained and so on. And when that happens, we then see a situation in which basically you get into a debt trap. Can you escape your debt? Do you have to keep paying your debt? Well, yes, if it's private debt, if it's debt held by people whose claim to be paid in the future on obligations made in the past is held up. That was part of what happened with the subprime crisis in the US. We had people whose homes were devalued. They often had loans on their mortgage loans on those properties that were suddenly worth far more than the houses against which those loans were made. But essentially, there was they called it the policy suggestion. This goes to the crisis time of 2008, 9, and 10. The policy suggestion was to have a cram down of loans, to say that your debt, which was 100, should be made equal to 80 or to 60 because your house just lost value and it's now worth only 80 or 60. So let's balance the debt on your house versus the value of your house at least. But what happened in that case was that these claims, these debt instruments, had been securitized and globalized, and the global funds that held these funds were not willing to accept the cram downs, and so essentially the people suffered because of that. Now, my friends at UNCTAD, they talk about debt-led growth as a phenomenon in the world today, that so many areas are stuck with having to rely on debt, being unable to escape the debt trap, that essentially it's a problem of getting out and having your necessaries paid for, your system of provision, despite the fact that you've got debt circling your neck. Argentina, of course, is perhaps the most dramatic case in Latin America. But yeah, this is the implications of my way of looking at of this approach is just to say that yes, debt is going to be there, and then how it's handled depends, and whether it persists or grows, what happens then depends on the commitments that are made to rebalance or to make other decisions to either, offset that debt with investments that go to areas that need the investment, or whether those with money will flee those areas and go elsewhere. Now, this brings us maybe to, I think, Gustavo's question, the financialization of economies and the international transfer of financial capital and so on can definitely modify the dynamics of uneven geographic development. No doubt, this in effect goes to the fact that, when we see, for example, firms that are, let's go with financialization per se, financialization in the sense of the growing presence and importance of financial claims, activities, and processes as sources of profit and rentier income in capitalist economies. This is something that has opened the door often to foreign ownership, to the international transfer, indeed, of financial capital. And for example, when we saw in the crisis of the 90s in Mexico, when we saw the kind of widespread failure of many Mexican-owned banks and the takeover of much of the Mexican banking system by foreign banks, we see that Citibank comes in and the other banks come in, Santander and others, and they're not interested in investing and making loans in Mexico. They're interested in basically extracting rent from Mexico. And so there's this problem of, are you dedicated to this space, and in what way? Is it something where you are taking money out and that's your main objective, or are you interested in sitting there and investing in? And so this becomes a problem. This globalization of the transfers of financial capital has been something that's made the rich richer and the poor poorer, in general terms. Let's go then to maybe Marcia's question, and then let's go to Jose Carlos, and finally we'll go to Noemi. Marcia is talking about private debt as having a negative effect on the current account. Could we think of a negative multiplier effect if we add the unequal distribution of income? Yes, absolutely. If we have an unequal distribution of income, we have the question of what are people who have the increasing shares of money, especially the famous 1%, what are they going to do or want to do or need to do with money that that accrues to them above and beyond some level? Well, it's not going to go back and circulate back in the community. They don't need it for that. There becomes the priority on keeping their money safe and making more money on more money. And so this takes away from the sort of the circularity of the money flows that is kind of an ideal of cash flows in the community that's an ideal that'll take us actually to part of this question about a post-capitalist way of working and living. Now let's go then to Jose Carlos. And Jose Carlos is asking about, decisions over space and sort of raising the question of racial segregation and the fact that this all seems to be linked up to a capitalist mode of production and linking to the city. And of course, my examples of racial segregation were played out against the context of a city. Well, first of all, racial segregation, I think, is an independent force that doesn't depend on urban living per se. If we go to the southern states in the U.S. into the history of slavery and post-slavery, we see that they're actually in the rural areas, in the countryside, there were great exploitative systems that played off on racism and on hatred and cruelty toward Black people. And of course, Latinos in the US were similarly, affected by policies that played out in terms of people being farm workers in many cases, as well as urban workers and urban residents. So you're right that I do have an urban bias in the way I think. I was an urban activist before I became an economist, so that's part of my bias. And grew up in a big city and all of that. But let's go to your notion of post-capitalism. And I think two things. One is, are there other modes of production that could allow us to break this circle? And I would say yes, absolutely. One of the alternatives I'd like to throw out there is the idea of the cooperative economy. My friend Jessica Nemhart Gordon has done a lot of work on Black cooperatives actually in the US as centers of resistance to capitalism and to racism. And Jessica and some of her colleagues, and co-thinkers are working on the idea of transforming transforming economies into cooperative-led rather than capitalist share. Now, that's a long discussion, but just to say that there's really something there. And I'd like to tie this to the idea that's very popular, increasingly popular, of circular economies. The idea of circle, of making things move together in a circle rather than from one end to another, is something that people such as Kate Rayworth and others are thinking with her donut economy idea, and many of our economics thinkers are having us think about. And this idea actually goes to the idea in part to, can't we create communities, no matter where they are, where we grow our own food, where we exchange goods locally? There's a concept that some of my colleagues who are geographers in Leeds and elsewhere, they're talking about the idea of the 15-minute city, or the 15-minute neighborhood. Can we reorganize a city so you can take care of all of your needs within 15 minutes walking distance of your home? Can we cut the dependence on the car and on other transport systems? So it's I think there's a big discussion about urban spaces and rural spaces. And, there's lots of questions about how income and, from farm income and from natural sources and from agricultural goods is valued, and the transfer prices amongst these. Sunanda is listening, and there's a huge debate about the transfer prices between agriculture and non-agricultural in India and other places. So this is a debate that we really need to have. And finally, let me turn to Noemi's question. You're right. The structuralist analysis, if we think of it, structuralism is spatial. Whether you were a Marxist or a historian or a Keynesian, it had to do with that exchange between a center and a periphery. Of course, we might mention our good friend Sheila Dow and her mentor Vicky Chick, and the way that they've done work talking about center and periphery dynamics in monetary and credit systems as, again, something that's very spatial. where did that get lost? Well, I think, in some sense, it gets lost when we cease to think that we need to have levels of analysis in the macro, meso, and micro, or the recognition of these different spatial scales in the work we're doing. When we see the central banks, basically, central bankers around the world, including Brazil, including Mexico, many places, where they kind of embrace this dynamic general equilibrium model as a framework. And that's a model, again, that basically refuses the idea that space matters. It really just says, there's equilibrium paths and we can find them and they're out there and let's go. And if there's a problem, there must be if there's a problem that's encountered, it must be something that the government did to interfere with the workings of the market. That kind of thinking is something that, sort of takes the whole lived reality and simply puts it out of the picture. And so in some sense, there's always this battle between economists in the global south, let's say, in countries like Mexico, Brazil, and so on, economists who embrace the mainstream, who feel that to be a mainstream economist is to be modern, is to participate in with the advanced economies and the latest thinking, and that therefore, in saying that, let's say that the central bank's role is to fight inflation, period, that they are simply taking ideas that are accepted in the prosperous places in the world, why not here? And that then creates this tension between people who are mainstream economists there and people who are heterodox, and that bias between mainstream and heterodox, who's legitimated and who's less legitimated, who's using more mathematics and who's using less, who has the power of wealthy interests behind them, and who is with the people. All those biases get introduced and played out on a policy scale and played out in the corridors of universities as well. So we begin to lose the academic memory. We begin to lose and to cease to have people like, let's say, Celso Furtado, who was a philosopher, historian, as well as economist. We cease to have people like that in our academy, and we start to have people who are mainly just emulating mentors who are working with equilibrium models for economic worlds that don't exist. And I would just say one of the questions was about, could we have a balance with space? Well, let's get some Martians in here and find out. So thank you for that. I'll stop here and let's see if we have more time.
Thank you for answering these questions. We have two more questions. One is from Washington Quintero, and he writes, when the space becomes an important element in the economic analysis in the capitalism system, and how the historical processes are affected by this configuration. This is the one. The second one is from Professor Luis Raúl. I don't know if Professor Luis Raúl wants to ask his question.
Yeah.
Your mic.
Gracias.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Dymski. I like a lot your presentation. Bring me a different perspective of things I've been thinking about. It's just a brief question. I mean, and it's very practical one. As if I understood correctly your presentation, regular financial institutions will never serve these segregated spaces. I mean, they're not going to provide them with the regular products because, I mean, if I understood correctly, they may think they are risky or more risky than the let's say the white, in your example, the example you put in there, the white neighborhoods and the black neighborhoods, you know, the black neighborhoods are going to be out of the market in that sense. What possible solutions have you thought about this can be implemented here? Because it's clear that the market is not going to solve this. I mean, actually, the market or the free market, as understood in the modern economy, is the cause this kind of things. I mean, it's the cause, is not the solution. So Have you thought about something that we can try in there in terms of public policy?
Yeah, thank you for those two questions, and thank you, Professor.
Sorry,
Uh,
sorry, Professor. We have another one.
Okay.
Is from Eduardo Ura. I don't know if he's wanted to make it, but I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it. What are the implications of financial geography in outer space? Are you
Yes.
are you considering off-planet spatial boundaries?
I think let's go to that one, because that I appreciate the question and the sense of humor. Actually, I would say you will notice if you try some of my suggested balances that everything has to add up. You will see that actually everything doesn't quite add up, and so this is something that we have to keep in mind. And I'm thinking of I think a session in November 2020, 2018, November, at the United Nations at UNCTAD in Geneva. There was a session that I was participating, and the Stephanie Blankenberg, who runs the Debt and Development Division, she put on the stage the director of strategy for the IMF, and she had him talk about the problems that they encounter when they're doing their programs. So rather than forcing him to defend the IMF's policies, they said, like, how does the world look to you? And one of the things that he said was, well, first, that there are so many knowledge problems that they have. For example, he said, we don't really know how much debt there is in the country if we're intervening in the country. Why? Well, think about it. Think about modern financial systems and accounting systems. You have multinational corporations and multinational banks operating across borders in your country. Where are they declaring their income? Where are they declaring their costs? Where do they pay taxes or not? Right? I mean, these are questions that are very flexible and can be answered very flexibly. So he was saying, our first problem is we come in there, and who's going to tell us the truth? Well, the truth itself is socially constructed. So this becomes a real problem. Now, just to say that that's something we have to keep in mind as we consider. We'll get to the professor's question last, but first let's go to the Martians. We can think of the idea that by escaping into space, we can find resources there. But notice that, in a sense, if you think of it, suppose some of these rich people go colonize Mars, and suppose they find something magical there, and they turn it into currency, or they turn it into something, and it becomes as valuable as gold or something. Well, if you think of it, the ownership won't be the ownership of the Martians. The ownership would be the ownership of the people who went and did that space voyage and bring that stuff back. And so insofar as it's, for example, a private enterprise, if it's the Jeff Bezos, spaceship, well, Jeff Bezos Corporation is going to be able to extract the rentier income on that now scarce stuff that comes from Mars. So in a sense, extraplanetary exploration just deepens our problem of how do we circulate the income and wealth and the claims on income and wealth that are associated with the activities that we have. So, since we don't have Martians to trade with, it would be people who've gone to Mars and come back that we have to trade with. And that, of course, becomes a problem. Now, actually, let's go then to Washington's question. I think when does space become important? Is it, when do we see the periphery and the central economies emerge? And, how does this interact with history? I would say a couple of things here. One is that, the colonization and decolonization process, the imperialism, that was associated with the taking of space and resources in the peripheral world and bringing back to what was then the European center. This is something that was, in some sense, pre-capitalist. And actually, this is something that I was mentioning. I'm going to be giving a talk in India next month. And this is something that figures in the earliest work of Sunanda Sen, as she was looking at the Indian currency system and how that was fit into the British Empire. So, empires before capitalism, while they were capitalists, but before they let the peripheral countries into the capitalist sphere, were exploiting them for their resources and trading at very disadvantageous terms for the developing countries with them. Now, I would just say, thinking again of the UN for a minute, if we think of the countries gathered together at a big UN meeting, there's going to be some countries who are basically only going to be able to acquire international capital, financial capital, on concessionary terms. That would actually be numerically most of the countries that would be sitting in the United Nations General Assembly. They are not able to hit the markets. There's no market. You can take their currency and try to get, to exchange it for anything of value anywhere in the world outside of that country. And it's not going to work. They're outside of that financialized capitalist sphere of circulation. Now, actually, once countries enter that sphere and they become part of, let's say, how about the BRICS, the popular developing economies. Let's have a BRICS portfolio. Let's have then there's a new thing. Let's have the Indonesian and, this portfolio and that portfolio. You have countries that are subordinate in terms of their relationships. Their currencies are low on the currency hierarchy. They're not tradable anywhere, but they have access to foreign capital on those asymmetric terms. Asymmetric power is at work, and that leads to very difficult situations. Mexico, of course, would be one of those countries. Brazil would be another. Argentina, another. The bigger Latin American countries have for years been on the peripheral sphere side of the global capitalist system, and in ways that have led to crisis after crisis. That'll be our starting point for tomorrow's talk, is to look at some of the patterns of crisis around the world. And finally, let's go to Professor Luis Raul, and his question about financial institutions are not going to serve poor spaces with regular financial products. Absolutely, because they are high risk. Well, yes, they are. That area 2, area 1 shows why. If one place is not lending in area 1 and area 2, guys, it was, and the other institution is not as well, then of course that area is riskier, all things equal. When you add in what might be employment discrimination and other forms of discrimination, maybe a higher proportion of female headed households, maybe a higher proportion of people in the prison industrial complex, etc., then of course you have these multiplying factors of inequality that increase risk in those areas. And so there's where the social, as John was saying, would definitely dominate the material. Those things ramify together. Now, what you need really are policies that force those institutions to basically play more fair and to serve their entire market areas. This was something that, speaking of being an urban activist, we fought for years on the idea of the Community Reinvestment Act and forcing the banks to be accountable. Many debates about whether they were interested in being accountable. In many of the community meetings, again, that I participated in, both as an academic and before that as a community activist, we would go in and talk to the bankers, and they, in their minds, when they were making loans to these, lower income or, areas, even though it's just part of the city, they would see it as a concession, as, as a loan they had to make, not one they wanted to make. So the bias and the social biases and perceptual biases ran deep. And of course, those were augmented by racism and sexism and so on. And so that was, that's something where you need a government that's going to make a commitment. How can that be done? Well, one thought would be if you look at the KfW model in Germany, the KfW, their big development bank, KfW regularly takes loans that are made to small business, medium-sized business in Germany across the cities and towns and securitizes them and basically takes that securitized money and then makes it a promise to pay of the German state so that it receives a very advantageous interest rate in the market. Hyman Minsky, when he was at the Levy Institute, designed together with Randy Ray and Dimitri Papadimitrios and others there at the Levy, Ronnie Phillips and others were part of that. They designed a system that would be basically like a KfW style system for what would be a network of inner city banks. Again, there's my urban bias, but forgive me, that would have that job of recirculating credits. And that would at the same time bring about standards and maintain the idea that there should not be exploitative loans and that there should be training and capacity building in these areas that have been historically neglected and subjected to often racially motivated patterns of poverty. That was a proposal. That was 1991 when they made the proposal. The Clinton administration was coming into force. Clinton was going to make some proposals because he was a fan of the Grameen Bank, and he did. But when the proposals were put into force, Minsky's ideas were rejected. The idea that there should be this sort of governing presence, this strong hand to encourage economic development was set aside. And what happened instead, of course, 4 years later, the first subprime loans were made. And they were made by unsupervised non-banks owned by mega banks. And there was a Federal Reserve that was unwilling to bring any force of law of the civil rights law against them. And so basically power won the day and the result was a disaster. Now, it's been many twists of the road since then, but we're going to need, whether it be in the north of England, whether it be in Cornwall, whether it be in Newfoundland, we're going to need proactive movement by government and force. And there's where we have to turn to Polanyi, the idea of the balance between the market and the state to ensure the welfare of the community. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gary. We have one last question. I don't know if you want to resolve it right now, or maybe you are.
It's fine. I see. Is it Nancy has a hand up, or is it Alberto?
Nancy wants to ask, and I'm going to read the last question.
Okay.
Could the analysis of financial geography help the monetary authorities on preventing the burst of financial bubbles by incorporating the space analysis? Okay.
Yeah, let me get to that. Go ahead.
No, let me give you the word to Nancy Belmont.
Okay.
Nancy, right now you can open your mic and ask your question, please.
Thank you, Doctor. Professor, good afternoon. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Well, I'm reading Stiglitz recently, and I was thinking of two ideas. He says that in the 90s, they went so far with the regulation, especially with politics that regulate the capital market. Also says they didn't need to regulate everything, but find the correct regulation. So he suggests to find the equilibrium between the functions of market and state. But nowadays, in a global world, Professor, is it possible to find that equilibrium in each country with their particularities to regulate, for example, the transfer of capital around the world that cause these inequalities that are the obstacle of development and growth?
Nancy, I appreciate that. You're asking, in a sense, the most profound question. We're going to talk about that on Thursday, and I'm afraid I've been working with Patty and her colleagues somewhat at the UN, and I'm afraid we don't have clear answers at this point. But let me get to the question of Adalberto
Thank you.
first, and then we'll get to, then we'll say something to Nancy, and then so that could the analysis of financial geography help the monetary authorities to prevent bursting bubbles by bringing in space? Absolutely. In fact, I saw that Martin Sokol, who's the secretary of the financial geography group, was in the audience earlier. I don't know if Martin's still here, but this is one of the ideas that we have, is by combining analyses, between economics and geography, and strengthening the analysis of financial geography, that we should, hopefully, we can have more impact, more influence on policy, to say that, because I mean, my view, and as John saw, my project in part is to say, our analysis has to be spatial. It already is, whether or not we can invisibilize the spatial dimensions, but they are there. And once we see them, then they force us to confront inequalities and challenges of flows across borders and making things work, and what inclusion means, and the fact that there's not just an individual, but a spatial dimension. Then these things become visible. And for example, the measures that we can take are then we can take with our eyes open. Like right now, for example, there's, as we see the London housing market become more unaffordable, housing prices moving out of sight, it's changing the balance of who can afford to live in London. That has a push-on effect into the outer areas, and in other cities, Birmingham and Leeds and so on, you're seeing housing prices rise. So there's a problem of the availability of housing, affordable housing for people. Now, in the case of the British people, they're used to being homeowners. So we're seeing the unavailability of an asset that's crucial for everyday life. This is something where spatial analysis is fundamental, so we see and can take policy action. Now, whether there's a will to do that is something that, again, we're going to try to talk about tomorrow. I'm going to talk about the idea of power at a distance, that when things are at a distance, you can tend to ignore them. When the starving people, the desperate people are in other countries or other regions, they're not your problem. And so that the problems are there to be solved, but do we have the political will? That becomes a problem. And there's where this thing I started with, this idea of people who, in some sense, as voters, are angry because they've been left behind, voting against people who promise government solutions because they see that everything is just against them. So, to Hades with everything, we have a problem, because, whereas say in Polanyi, it's the community that protects the people against the state that stands as the defender of the people against the market that has its own logic, that gets punctured. And suddenly it's everything against everybody, and it becomes the triumph of nihilism, instead of anything that means anything. And we're lost as people and as a planet. And Nancy, the deregulation went too far. And one of the problems, and I have to say, I woke up this morning realizing that I don't know the solution. One of the problems was that the system, as it became bigger and as financialization proceeded and more things got financialized, and as you have contingent claims, derivatives and other kinds of things, some people defending against financial risks, other people taking risks, this system got bigger and bigger and bigger. The asset funds got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the money that's circulating around the world grew to scales that are crazy and out of control. This was the system that almost crashed, or that actually did crash in 2008, and that was saved. And now this is a system that is hyper leveraged, out of control, unaccountable, that lives in sort of tax havens that even exist within countries as well as outside of countries. And basically now that's the system that's in danger of cracking, and that we must save, we, the people, must save if we want to avoid a financial collapse, where the collapse of these giants will cause life as we know it to come to a halt because it's so interwoven with our everyday practices. This is a problem. How do you take the sting, the air out of that thing, when indeed they've now recruited the central banks to be at the base of the global money market? This is a problem that we don't know the answer to. So yeah, we got to do something. And I'm afraid I don't have the answers other than, we try to frame the questions accurately, but we'll try to get to where we at least understand the scale. And, ultimately, there's going to be huge shocks. And there's where, when those shocks come, and it really is time to transform the global system into something that works for people rather than for the hyper rich, we have to basically be ready with a plan. Because as Minsky used to say, he used to walk around the levee, he'd say, takes a model to beat a model. It takes a number to beat a number. It takes a plan to beat a plan. So he would sometimes, when he'd see me there in the summer, when he used to bring us together, sometimes he'd say, Dymski, what's the model of the model? And that's still the question. What's the model of the model? That's what John Smithen asks us. What's the social that can control the material? How do we get there? And that was a grand, amazing theorist asking a question of me as the next generation, and I'll ask that question of you. We're running out of time on planet Earth, but we got to confront these questions. I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much, Professor, for answering these questions. And I'm, in order to conclude this session, I'm going to give you the word to Professor Nemi Levy. Open your mic, please.
We cannot hear you, Noemi. It's unusual for us.
So
Very unusual. You're right. Here, I think I think I put the wrong one. Wait, 2 seconds. I want to open 1 minute. Okay, here we go. I want to thank everyone very much for this. Gary, John, and all the participants, and remind you that tomorrow we will continue. And I would like to present this Constancia, I don't know how you say it in English, to John Smithen. I would have given him in hand if we would be here. I will be sending it through the mail. And thank you, John, for your wonderful comment. And thank you, Gary, for your good and wonderful lecture. See you tomorrow. Les agradezco a todo mundo la presencia, el haber aguantado 2 horas. Creo que fue muy interesante. Esto nos abre la discusión para seguir mañana y pasado. If you're there, John.
Yep, thank you very much, Naomi, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good night.
See you tomorrow.
Good night.
Bye.
Buen día. Thank you, Penny, for staying with us.